All right, guys. So I'm going to have to probably break this lecture up in several parts. So I'm calling this lecture 1.2, and I'm going to try to give you a little introductory idea into my philosophy on history and how uh, it came about and created some of the institutions that we have today, and why society is basically ruled by dummies, and how we protect ourselves from dummies. So uh, so bear with me if for some reasons some things are not fully explained, because I'm sure I'll be able to explain some of these things more in detail in other lectures. Uh, so first of all, you want to go back to history, to when basically civilization started, and you know, I started out here with Egypt, and Egypt was probably considered one of the first world empires. Well, actually, it was simply because of its influence. When you think about empires, it's all about their influence and the things that they invented and contributed to society and to mankind. And so, when you go back to Egypt, I mean, they were very intelligent people back then, and some of the earliest, you know, engineers and philosophers and people who uh, try to figure out the world, try to come up with ideas on how to run a society. And as you know, that philosophy is all limited by your experiences, and then you make discoveries on on our consciousness, the human conscious, and which is another way of saying our emotional psychology, and and then you try to act accordingly. And if you're in a position of power, um, you know you 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 act upon that knowledge and or those conclusions that you think you might have. And a lot of things in their earlier periods, they again, they didn't have that much experience, so they had to go by what was obvious to them. So if it made more sense to rule by birthright, um, you know it, it was like that because it was an easy way of settling disputes. It's like you can take a tribe of people and say, oh well, who should tell us what to do, who should guide us, who should be the leader. And usually it was the wise man, the older one, the patriarch, and then that later ballooned into the idea of birthright, and as the tribe expanded to a mass of people who maybe started a civilization and so forth, then obviously you would go back to this idea of a birthright. So that's how things started. Most people know this. It's pretty much common sense. It's not nothing to be debated at length. So, but then from Egypt, as time progressed, then you had these other philosophers, and you had Confucius, which was more of an Eastern philosopher, and while they might not have had any contact with people of North Africa, like in Egypt or anything like that. Still, mankind, just the nature of being human, we all have certain things in common and some basic things, very basic things. And that's really what I want to talk about here, because all these philosophers throughout history are just learning what's common among mankind, which is the basic human nature of selfishness. What makes us different than animals, beyond our creativity, or actually this is where our creativity comes from, is we desire things that are beyond our basic needs, which is like food, shelter, and that sort of thing. Animals could care less about that. Even when they mate, that's a natural thing to help them survive and perpetuate their species. But they don't know why they're doing it. They don't have, these ideas of, rivalry and stuff like that. I mean, they do to an extent, but it's more of a survival thing. It's not that they're thinking, well, I gotta, rule the world and rule everything. But at the same time, because they're animals, and part of their survival is to dominate their territory, their land, the food supply, and so forth. A lot of things that they do, is not out of intelligence, so to speak. It still goes back to just surviving. Whereas humans are different. Humans, we pretty much are like animals in that we have the same instincts, but we, we can desire things just for the sake of desiring, just because we want them. It might have nothing to do with our immediate needs for food and shelter and that sort of thing. And then this gives us creativity. The kind of creativity that we invent things. We try to figure out ways to deal with each other on a more efficient basis. We try to improve ourselves, make progress as a society, and a lot of those things come out of the fact that we first have to our nature is we think that certain things that are not key to our survival are necessary in order for us to survive. And I've always said this, and that's what Spider Bite Venom philosophy is all about. And what happens is, throughout time, the more we do this, and as a matter of fact, it's the only way that mankind can dominate the animal kingdom, and that's the only way mankind can actually perpetuate itself, is to desire things that are beyond our immediate needs, like food, shelter. But as a result, we make the world a little bit more complicated, obviously, and then that creates new desires and new needs for survival. So, whereas today we have to work and at a job and go to the grocery store and to find food or to buy food, there's no way we could fulfill that need the same way someone did it, thousands of years ago, which is maybe hunting and gathering food and that sort of thing. So basically, that's kind of a reason why civilization started, and as civilization grew and made progress in that regard, then you had these philosophers like Confucius and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and then some of the Stoics like Marcus Aurelius, and so many others. I couldn't fit them on here, but these philosophers, the main thing that they were finding out, discovering, was that there are things that we can control and there's things that we can't control. And most of the things that we think we can't control, we actually can, which is ourselves. But the reason why we think we can't control them is because they're rooted in selfishness. And selfishness is rooted in fear. At some basic level, we want to obviously be selfish, which is afraid of dying at some level. Otherwise, we wouldn't survive. But, anything beyond that is, can cause us problems. And it complicates things. And that's what these philosophers were realizing, is that, mankind is dominated by fear, and fear makes you stupid. Fear makes you dumb and retarded. And especially in the eyes of other people who are just as afraid and just as dumb and retarded, because everybody's trying to get what they think they need for survival, which is stupid, and but at the same time, it's kind of like the Tao philosophy, where what goes up must come down, and what's coming is going, and what's black is white, and that sort of thing. And you cannot have a perpetuation of anything in the universe without chaos and this kind of nonsense that is, when it comes to human nature. So as these philosophers were starting to notice these things and talk about these things and write about these things, then you had them try to incorporate some sort of mythology or even religion. Like if you look at Saint Augustine of Hippo, he was instrumental in incorporating Christianity into Western society. And that's because, he didn't probably understand this, but it's just a manifestation of the fact that, he realized that if people believed in something beyond themselves, then, and take, historical facts like the birth of Christ and that sort of thing, then you could teach people or persuade them to voluntarily control themselves. This was kind of an answer to some of the earlier philosophers who thought that it was basically impossible to teach these things, even though they tried it, and even though they had their their own mythologies and their own gods and so forth, but they just kind of perpetuated the idea that, and whether there's no judgment here, whether they thought it was whether the idea was good or not. There's always, again, a good and bad to a pro and a con to everything. But anyways, they're more or less, their ideas was, look, there's a society, that is basically run by idiots and dummies because they're all selfish. And we need something physical to actually, control us, control society. And, they were kind of stuck in this dilemma between, what the Egyptians learned. Well, I'm sorry, what the Egyptians, what they felt the Egyptians were ignorant of, and what they felt like what the world needed. And then, and then when Saint Augustine of Hippo came along, he just kind of made it to where, he was able to get people to think about something higher than themselves, symbolize it, and use art and use use Christianity itself to instill morality in people so that they would be less selfish and more compassionate. And then when you had somebody, like over on the eastern side, that like Confucius, and then some of the Taoist philosophers, they they kind of was on the same track, but as we'll learn a little bit later, they kind of had some different ideas on how to do that. They felt like making philosophy more explicitly towards religion doesn't necessarily do a lot, because now it could backfire. I shouldn't say it wouldn't do a lot, because they, a lot of them, didn't never, a lot of them did believe in God. Most of them, I would say, did. They just, they felt like their philosophy should be more secular in the sense that if you can get people to understand that, there are things that they can control and things that they can't, and understand that there's always a up and down, and right and wrong, and coming and going, then with no judgment on any of that, there's no need for morality, then people would automatically kind of do the same thing on their own. And they felt like, again, that adding religion to it could possibly corrupt things, and because, again, it doesn't eliminate the people who who are not going to be voluntarily moral people, so that's been kind of the nature of philosophy throughout the ages, and it's just kind of ongoing debate, even though kind of never explained that way. But then that kind of ushered in, this whole modern day era, and and through that, obviously the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and all that, and to what we have today. And some of the philosophers, and I'm going to get more in detail about this later, but some of the philosophers, were trying to help the monarchies of Europe, to try to, civilize basically the world, and a lot of them had some ideas that were no different than back from their predecessors. As a matter of fact, they just kind of perpetuated those ideas. But what they did do different was they figured out that they had to give some kind of an illusion of of egalitarian, how would you say, this kind of utopia where everybody can be selfish and everybody can desire things beyond their basic needs. Because the way they figure was, well, you can't control those people anyways. So why not give them the illusion, like you can have your cake and eat it too, but at the same time have mechanisms within government to protect themselves from these masses of dummies. And that's because a stupid person is a dangerous person. Throughout history, one of the reasons why philosophy came out in the first place was because people were trying to answer questions like, why is there evil in the world? Why do people kill each other? And that sort of thing. Why is it that people can't just agree upon some leader who's all wise and all knowing? And I mean, they had the gods that they worshipped, but it seemed like the gods never manifested themselves in real life. And what would you do if a certain amount of people didn't believe in God? That again, it's just this was the whole reasons for philosophy. So during the medieval period, these monarchies and then on through the Renaissance, they came up with these ideas of how to protect themselves, and they took a lot of lessons from their predecessors. If you go back to Marcus Aurelius during the Roman period, he basically was an emperor, but the emperor was chosen kind of democratically, so to speak, every so often. And the Roman Empire was a republic. And if you look at a republic, republic was way different than the empires of the past. Especially like you go all the way back to the Egyptians. Where you just had the pharaohs, and the pharaohs, was the god, the judge, and king of everybody. In the Roman Republic, you kind of had this process where it seemed like you could vote in or put in people, a mass of people can elect or decide on, or maybe just a group of people who represented everybody could vote in or elect a new leader. And then that would, obviously gain the confidence of the ones that they're supposedly representing. And then if for some reason they would lose confidence in that leader, then that group of that council of representatives or whatever can vote the leader out of that position. And that in a lot of sense was great. It kind of kept this the stability of the Roman Empire for a very long time. But eventually, because of a lot of reasons, the Roman Empire fell, but it primarily had to do with again this never ending riddle, if you want to call it that, of why mankind is always selfish, has desires beyond their physical needs. And even when they do know how to do right, this desire keeps coming up and it can never be satiated. So that degeneracy, obviously, in the Roman Empire just like the Greeks and the ones before it, and kind of in a similar way, and whereas the ways before it were more horrific, but but that you know that was a good start as far as this this mechanism being created to protect ourselves, to protect society from the masses of dummies. And so the monarchies of medieval Europe and in that time period on through the Enlightenment, they learned a lot of lessons from history. They were primarily historians. Their advisors were historians. The philosophers that lived at that time were historians, and they kept noticing this pattern over and over again that the ruling class had to, or not the ruling class, so to speak, but there had to be a system that would protect itself from the masses of selfish idiots and dummies and retarded people who were dangerous. I mean, every so often the masses of people would get angry and fearful and want to overthrow the system. And then that system would oftentimes, whether it was a monarchy or or as we learn, appears of Genghis Khan and them. I mean, it was just a bunch of tribes fighting each other and killing each other. They had to learn that they had to have a system where you could kind of inoculate the killing, the overthrow, and then kind of pacify, the masses of dummies and idiots that would, from time to time get angry and afraid and want to overthrow things. So that led to, this whole idea of democracy and the monarchies. They came up with this ideas like, especially in the British system. The British Empire, they start to come up with different ideas of parliamentary systems and judicial systems and that sort of thing. But still, behind the shadows, the monarchy had the last say so. And then when you go later on into our period, before our period, actually, slightly before it, the Renaissance, where you had the people who went over from Europe to the United States and saw that most of it wasn't that the United States was a whole new it was a whole new side of the world, the North American territories and the South American territories, and they were not very populated, because most of the people there were quote unquote savages, and a lot of them were spread out through this vast territory, and they never had to deal with trying to figure out how to live together in these they were still living under the ideas of tribes, and the elder tribesman was the leader and the birthright and that sort of thing, but the population was so small that it didn't really outnumber the number of people that was coming over from Europe. So when the people from Europe came over, they came over with all these lessons they have learned, and trying to, build up the European civilization. And they try to, you could say they enforce these ideas on some of the native people in the Western world, or in North America and Latin America. But what they were more concerned is how to build a new society without the monarchies, because they knew that the monarchies were still the puppet masters. They were still just kind of giving you the illusion, and they knew that the religion, primarily the Christian religion of Europe, was through the Vatican, through the Pope, and all that was just as corrupt as a monarchy. If you go through the history of the papacy, it's just as corrupt as all the systems of monarchies, and that's because anytime you have any kind of man-made institution, any kind of man-made system, you're going to have it's going to be rooted in selfishness, which makes everybody retarded and dumb and stupid. And it always creates this dynamic where someone who's in line to become the next ruler or what have you is going to be selfish and do stupid things and try to overthrow, and then becomes a civil war or some kind of conflict where someone gets killed, and it's the same thing. So the Europeans that came over to what's now called the United States, North America, Latin America, and that sort of thing, they tried to create something new, and something that was kind of similar to what they came from, with all the lessons learned, but at the same time without the monarchies. And so, they created the United States, and obviously under the United States, they created the Constitution. And if you look here, again, there's no judgment as to whether this system is better than the other. It's just, I'm just trying to teach you how mankind has learned to protect itself from dummies, from their own selfishness. And these institutions like the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive branch, they were kind of built off of the philosophies from the Stoics and the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, to where they would have these checks and balances, so that you would have the illusion of a democracy, but at the heart, it's still a republic, still an emperor, still someone in charge. And but the way they did in the United States was kind of unique, because they made 3 branches that were co-equal, and a constitution that was the rule of the land, not some monarchy, some dummy out there ruling by decree. But and I'm going to talk about this more in another lecture, but it was designed so that all the dummies that made up the population could elect representatives, and then those representatives would have pretty much as much power as the other 2 branches, but there were checks and balances, so that those masses of dummies and idiots would not overthrow the government itself. And that's because one thing that you learn in the Bible, and thanks to the perpetuation under Saint Augustine of Hippo, the perpetuation of Christianity, is that or the Judeo-Christian idea of teaching of the fact that the witness of 2, when you have an odd number, 3, you have anytime a decision that needs to be settled by 2, you have a third party come in, and they would side with one or the other. So that's why you have 3 branches of government. So that way, when one needs to be checked, because they're out of line with the other 2, then the other 2 will ultimately make the decision. So based on that, and then also too, they created what's called the Electoral College in the United States, that made it a republic. And again, that was designed to protect itself from the dummies. And when I say the dummies, I mean I mean myself too. I mean everybody's stupid because we all desire things beyond our physical needs, and so they knew that it wouldn't matter, what a minority group of idiots and dummies, or even people with virtue. They knew they would never be a threat to society as long as there was an electoral college, as long as there was a republic. And so that created this whole system of politics where you would have a so-called election, but the election would start off with some pandering to a minority group of idiots and dummies who were so selfish that they felt like their voices needed to be heard, and they need to be recognized in some way, and basically be given a cookie to kind of shut the hell up. And but then once they were pacified, it's like sticking a pacifier in a baby's mouth. Once you do that, they stop crying. They feel like they're being listened to, and what have you. And then you can move on with the business of the day, which is obviously ruling. So the electoral college was ruled on, was created for that purpose, is to protect the republic from the masses of dummies. So that's why in the Congress you have it goes even a step further, and you have a House of Representatives, and then obviously the Senate. And the House of Representatives, if you notice, and I hate to say this because I'm black myself, but the House of Representatives represent all the dummies. And most black people are dummies, and most of the politicians that are in the House of Representatives, the ones that never get wise enough to understand what's going on and just always want to bitch and complain and cry about things, they usually never go any further than the House of Representatives, elected as House of Representatives. Because they bitch and they scream and they cry for the dummies who they represent. Whereas you go to the Senate, the Senate is where the actual republic is, and so the Senate is there to listen to the complaints and the bitching and the crying of the dummies in the House. And but if the Senate doesn't agree on what the House decides it wants to do, then they're done. And usually it's done anyways because the Senate represents all the states, and the states obviously represent their demographic of people in their country, and that's not based on population. In other words, their population could have a fraction of the population in another state, but yet they have equal power equal say so as far as representative goes in the representation in the government. So that being the case, and the fact that the blacks in the United States are a minority, a very small minority, only 12%, but a significant percentage to actually overthrow not overthrow, but to add advantage to a general election for a president. They're like any minority, and the founders of the United States, they knew this. Like any minority, they were just there to just kind of let them have the illusion that they can have their cake and eat it too, so they can bitch and cry and complain. And if they needed to, there's some things that they needed to change, based on morality or based on virtue, whatever. They could do that. If their grievances were legit, and it was in line with their Western Christian, Judeo-Christian, moral mode of conduct, then they could, decide that those were good things. Just like any good emperor, any good king, would maybe hear a case and decide, I think the right thing to do is not be selfish in this case, but to actually do the right thing. So, but at the same time, for all the out of control stupidity and selfishness that affects too many people, this was a check and balance on that. And so that, created a very powerful and stable government, called the United States. And because the vast territory of the United States is just as big as, any other continent, we consider it continental Europe, or if you go over to China, or, continental Asia, it's there as far as significant in size, and especially when all the all the governments, the other countries that surround the United States, and from North America to Latin America, pretty much, have the same type of political institutional setup. So that provided its own check and balance against what you still overhad and still had over in Asia. In Asia, when you look at China, they were more or less socialist, and in Eurasia, like Russia, they were more socialist oriented in their philosophy, and they kind of drew upon this Karl Marx idea of mob rule. But they knew that in order to control the masses of dummies in a system of mob rule, you had to have a really centrally strong government, which means you had to basically rule by force, or an iron fist, or however you want to call it. Because they learned the same lessons as the people in the medieval monarchies you learn in the medieval period in the Western world. That at some point you're going to have the masses of dummies uprising to try to overthrow. So, you had to rule with a strong iron fist in order to create more fear in trying to overthrow that system than your own selfish desires of whining and bitching, complaining about, what it is that you think you need that's beyond your physical needs. So with that being said, and like I said, I'm going to wrap this up because we'll go into a part 2 on this lecture. But that being said, that's why you now have 2 factions, or two. You have a check and balance in this world that protects everybody from the masses of dummies. And depending on which side of the world you live on, this is what you got to deal with. And that's why it's important to understand this. And what I'm teaching you here in Spider Bite Venom philosophy, because it's going to be the foundation to finding that peace of mind and learning what you can control and what you can't control, so you can focus just on that and learn how you can be happy, be a happy person, no matter what society you live in. And that's the whole aim of this. To wrap this up, you also see here, you have the Caliph, which is the Muslim world. They think that, neither the socialist system works, or neither the republic system work. The system of republic works. They think that a theocracy works, a man-made theocracy, in the sense that, you know, you can have some kind of caliph or some kind of descendant of some great religious leader, and have him rule. And but as we know that they have to use just as much fear and just as much use of power to subdue their people in order to stop them from being overthrown, and they still haven't solved the problem of corruption. Because again, they're they're no different than anybody else. I mean, they all have selfish desires, and there's always somebody bitching and complaining and crying about stuff. So that's their system. And then again, the Europeans, they, even though they have a democratic republic type system, they don't really have a republic type system. They still have a monarchies over there. All those European countries still have, even though they call them figureheads, they're still have to some degree some kind of ultimate power. And that's because this whole idea of creating an illusion started there in Europe, you're the one that's ruling everything. You're the one that in Parliament is running everything, but really it's a charade. It's just an illusion to keep the dummies and the ones that are constantly crying and bitching, complaining about stuff, to keep them pacified. So because they ultimately they're just as selfish as anybody else. They want to keep this whole idea that goes all the way back to the Egyptians, where it's by birthright that I'm the king or the queen of this and that, and so they feel like they justify what they're doing, because they feel like, I as long as I keep quote unquote making people happy by implementing these institutions of democracy, then they won't try to cut my head off. They won't drag me over to a guillotine and lop off my head. So to some degree, it kind of works there, but again, it has its own drawbacks, and but it's better in the sense that you have some of these other systems. But the problem is that ultimately the Western system of government, whether it's democracy or monarchy, and the Eastern system of government, which is socialism, Middle Eastern, which is more theocratic, that side, they want to dominate each other. They have, just as a body, as a society, as two society, rival society, they're they're like the Sith Lords in Jedi philosophy, where one feels like their way of governing things and governing world is better. So it's good that the United States basically was basically discovered, and then ultimately they discovered the nuclear bomb. And I mean, it's kind of tragic on one end, but at the same time, the Eastern side, they have their nuclear weapons, and so now there's this check and balance of mutual sure destruction, so that both the Eastern side and the Western side know that if somebody's stupid enough to try to rule both or overtake everything, that they would basically self-destruct and take us all down with them. This is the scary part. This is where we all have to, kind of be a little concerned, not overwhelmingly concerned, because nobody's that stupid. And plus, there's enough checks and balances in both types of systems to kind of prevent that. But this is why we have the systems that we have. This is why you see this never-ending conflict in a political sense. We could not afford a World War III like we had in World War II, because now that would end life on Earth as we know it. And the ones that are in these ruling parties know that. So we can kind of take comfort in that, while at the same time knowing that there's no guarantee for anything, and that we don't have to waste our lives trying to, undo all this stuff, because by human nature and by nature itself and by the laws of the universe and the fact that things go up and come down and go black and then white and then from organization to chaos. I mean, nature itself has a way of taking care of these things without us not having to intervene. And if we do try to intervene, it's just out of selfishness. So anyway, so we'll talk more about this. This is, like I said, an introductory part to this type of lesson, and until then, let's just think about it and move on to the next lecture.